Hi, I'm Peter Fisk, and I'm delighted to be with you here today at the Austrian Retail Forum. And I'm here to ask that big question and hopefully to give you some of my perspectives on answers. What happens next? So I'm going to try and answer that question from my perspective and to give you some ideas and thoughts and inspiration perhaps to move forwards. Three things which I'm going to look at today. Well, firstly, the changing world. How is it changing over the next 10 years, but how is it changing over the next 10 months? Secondly, how are businesses responding to that change in every different sector as well as in retail? And thirdly, what does it mean for you? As a leader of your business, what do you have to do both to survive and thrive in these difficult times, but also to create a better future? So let's get started. And the big question I think every executive should be asking themselves is, how do you see the future? What is it which you believe your business will look like in the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years? What is most important to you, and how will the world change your business of today? But it's an incredibly difficult time we live in, complex and uncertain. It's no reason to feel scary, if you like, in this world. So this uncertainty means that there's no answers like there used to be. We can't just keep doing the things, improving by 5% or 10% even each year. We can't try to improve incrementally to reduce the costs and improve the service. Instead, we have to think differently about how can we succeed in our future world. But that world is changing incredibly fast. If you look back over the last 250 years, we've seen phenomenal change in society. Think back to how telephones and telegraphs, they transformed society, the automobile, the aeroplane, the man on the moon, how it changed our dreams, how it changed where we work, how it changed how we shop, how it changed how we live. And then over the last 25 years, we've had this digital tsunami of change, reinventing almost every aspect of our lives. I actually think we'll see more change in the next 10 years than we've seen in all of that last 250 years. And I also think that the recent crisis, the pandemic, the downturn has shaken up things so much that we'll see an acceleration of that change even faster. So what are the big trends which were happening in the world anyway, and which we will see throughout the 2020s? Well, there's 5 things which I think are really important, which affect all of us in every country and in every sector. The first one, and it goes A, B, C, D, E. The first one, A, is for aging world. We see this huge shift. We've already seen it in places like Japan, but now in Europe as well, we see this huge shift from young to old. So the huge demographic change in terms of how do we support longer living elderly people. When you can live to 100 years like most young people will do today, then that means fundamental different things in terms of what will you do with your time, how will you get support financially, but also the care and nutrition to see you through those longer times. The second big trend is for booming Asia. There's one country which is actually growing during 2020. It's China. But across all of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia right now, you see a boom, not only in terms of businesses growing, but also in terms of people growing in terms of their wealth and disposable income. The new middle class of the world, if you like, are within those 4 billion people within Southeast Asia. The third change, perhaps the most talked about, is cognitive technologies. So not just technologies which are passive, but technologies which you can think. So intelligent artificial intelligence, which fuels those technologies to allow you to do things faster, differently, and better than ever before. Be it in terms of being able to talk to your customers as individuals, being able to operate your supply chains, or whatever it might be, that artificial intelligence enabled technologies which IoT, blockchain, and so many other things give us, transforms the ways in which we can live and the ways in which we can win. The fourth one is dense living. And actually, one of the biggest trends which we see right now is the consolidation of mega cities around the world. Currently, most of those new mega cities, 30 of them actually, are in China. But as we go through this next decade, we'll see the rise of Africa as well. So people coming together where the best healthcare is, where the best education is, and where they connect best physically, even in a digital world. And the fifth trend, E, is for environmental renewal, obviously. And perhaps more than anything, this recent crisis has been a wake-up call to the fragility of our world and our society. So how can business truly play a much bigger part in terms of solving those fundamental crises to do with the climate, which we now have? So those are the 5 big trends, which I think are being accelerated, all 5 of them, during the recent crisis. But if we look at some of them in slightly more detail, technology, obviously, we're now in what's called the 4th industrial revolution. But what does that fundamentally mean for you? Well, if you look at production companies, people who make food, for example, smart factories, automating the entire way production is made, or 3D printing, changing the entire fabric, the entire consistency of those foods. So the 4th industrial revolution, fundamentally driving us, connecting to humanity in new ways, will really have a big, big impact beyond just the automation of existing processes to fundamentally reimagining the way in which we learn, we live, and we work. But at the same time, how can we use that technology to solve some of the fundamental big problems which we have? Inequality, for example. How can we make businesses and brands more accessible to all different types of customers? How can we improve literacy, education, for example, in terms of well-being and your health? How can we give access to the best education into the world to anybody in the world? How can you use the 4th industrial revolution and new technologies, if you like, to solve some of those big problems? I think that's really one of our big challenges. And I think businesses, because they have brands, because they have customers, because they have money, because they're every day in people's lives, I think businesses have one of the best answers, if you like, to combining those 2 things together. And it is entirely possible. So if you look across the world, if you look at the data of the last 30 years, you can see GDP growing. For example, in this case, this is Germany. But in many, many different countries, you can see a growth of, say, 40% in GDP per capita over 30 years. But you can see almost an equivalent reduction in terms of CO2 emissions. It is possible to do better and to be better at the same time. So I guess the big question for all of us is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic, how has it really changed things? And we can get that by starting, if you like, from the outside in. Thinking about consumers and how has it changed both their attitudes and their behaviors. McKinsey did some recent analysis in terms of looking at what has changed most, and the answer is everything. But Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, he said for businesses, it's seen a fundamental shift from hierarchies to hierarchies. If you like, the reconfiguration of how we work, as we're now all working from home or remotely or virtually, then it connects us in different fundamental ways. Seth Godin, he says, maybe it's a message from the future, a wake-up call in terms of what we need to do. But be it in terms of the way we work at home, be it education, the biggest shift in education is not just kids learning online, but it's actually learning together. Peer-to-peer education has evolved incredibly fast as they've learned to learn virtually. Or you look at some of the businesses, Disney Plus, for example, launched during the pandemic. It was able to achieve the same market penetration in 5 months as Netflix took 7 years to achieve. So the speed at which some things have evolved incredibly fast is quite staggering. If we look a bit further in terms of how are consumers changing in their attitudes, well, you can see a series of different shifts in terms of what matters most to them. Let's just pick out a few. Some of the things which I find really interesting is that in developed countries, obviously it's made us more aware of social environmental issues, caring for each other and caring for our environment. And so we'll see an acceleration in terms of consumers choosing brands where that really matters and people are doing something practical about it. But it's also seen a shift where trust goes back to big companies which people know well, so more established companies. So all of those startups, those small businesses like craft beers, for example, they are the ones which people know less well and so have less trust in difficult times. So we see many, many different changes in terms of consumers and the behaviors during this pandemic, which may well last over time. It takes 66 days for a new habit to form. That's as the synapses in your brain, they re-engineer themselves, they connect in new ways. And if people start doing things for 66 days, for example, shopping online, then by the end of that period, it's become a habit. It's become the new normal for them. And so thinking about what are the shifts which we see in the world will be incredibly important as we think about what matters most for priorities in our business and how we can innovate for the future. Look at some of the winners. It might seem strange, but some companies have done incredibly well during this, what we feel is a difficult time. I dare to mention Amazon, but Amazon, they had to spend $4 billion to get themselves sorted out at the beginning, but then they saw $400 billion in terms of market value growth over the first 6 months of 2020. Thinking about how do we connect with each other. We all started using Zoom, for example. Eric Yuan, he moved from WebEx, where he was frustrated with the technology. He wanted to create a very simple way in which people could do video conferencing, and he created Zoom. And then he saw a tripling of his business value in the first 6 months of this year as we moved to that much more intuitive, simple way in which we connect together for work and for play. One of the most interesting was Tesla. Tesla became the most valuable car company in the world, bigger than all of those famous German brands like BMW and Daimler and so on together. Well, how did it do that? Well, actually, one of the interesting things about Tesla is it's not just a car company. The purpose statement of Tesla is actually to accelerate the world's transition to clean energy. So it's actually an energy company. And as we saw just this month, then the transition to new types of batteries with clean energy is actually at the heart of Tesla, both for its cars and everything else it does. And that's where most of its revenues and profits will actually come from. Others which have succeeded, PayPal, they created a new peer-to-peer service, which makes it incredibly simple for people both to pay online, but to pay each other. Mirror, they sold for $500 million, a startup created by a ballet dancer 1 year ago. So people can exercise at home and vainly watch themselves at the same time. And we talked about Disney. But of course, there were some losers, some big losers at the same time. WeWork was already heading for disaster in terms of people not living, working in those combined places, which had created incredibly fast. The airline industry obviously is in a traumatically difficult time. So Boeing, having seen an 80% reduction in their sales, and most airlines seeing around about a 60% reduction in their revenues. Hertz was one of the first companies to call in Chapter 11 and face bankruptcy at the start of the pandemic. They'd been living for too long in an outdated business model. But also interestingly, other companies like cosmetics company Coty, for example, one of the biggest in the world, saw a 60% reduction in their share price as people no longer felt they needed to wear makeup when they're wearing a face mask. And even oil companies with a reduction in travel and transport, they saw their share prices, including the world's then largest company, Saudi Aramco. So we see a world which is changing incredibly fast. The next question is, how have companies truly responded to that? It was an Austrian economist called Schumpeter who created the idea of what he calls Schumpeter waves. These are the upturns, but also the downturns, which we see throughout history in economic cycles. And you've seen these waves, the booms and the busts, come more rapidly over the last 250 years. What's really interesting is that actually innovation and new businesses starting doesn't happen during the booms. It tends to happen during the downturns. It tends to happen when the moments when markets are shaking up, when consumers think differently, and when entrepreneurs have to do something differently quite often. 57% of the Fortune 500 were founded during a downturn. So companies from McDonald's through to Apple, or more recently Uber through to Airbnb, have all been founded during a crisis. So there's something really interesting about how these times really shake things up, but also create new opportunities to do things differently. So what is it which we need to do in these difficult times, both to survive, but also to thrive? A very simple grid which I created. I call it the Survive and Thrive Matrix. To think about the things which you did during the crisis. Think about the things which you started. So those things, do you still need to continue doing? Maybe you could stop now, or maybe you need to continue them, but you make them part of your new normal. Maybe you do them in even better ways now that you've had time to implement them and to see how they work. But what about the things which you stopped during the crisis? Are those things going to stop permanently and you don't need to restart them because actually people don't need them? Or the things which you stopped which you can bring back now, but maybe bring back in a different or better way? So 4 different boxes to really think about how can you not just survive, but also use this time of shake-up to think about how do I start moving forwards in new but better ways, learning from how people have responded, and maybe actually finding things you'd never thought about or things which you'd never even dared to do beforehand. Look at some of the companies around the world. Danone. Emmanuel Faber, their CEO, he said at the beginning of this year, we're no longer a food company. We're a health company. So he thought about not just what he makes or what he does, but he thought about what he does for people. He gives them healthier lives. So a more purposeful company, and he's rapidly becoming what's called a B Corporation too, where that purpose is fundamentally at the heart of his business. And all of his brands now focus on how can they make people healthier. That's the core purpose of Danone today. And thinking about how does that trickle back to every single product and every single activity which they do. So a real focus for prioritization and also for decision making. We've also seen in the food sector some truly new brands emerge incredibly quickly. One of the biggest brands in America right now was only launched last year. It's called White Claw. It's a hard seltzer. It's basically mineral water with pure alcohol. And so creating new markets or creating new categories, if you like, is absolutely possible in these times of changing attitudes and changing preferences. Or take one quite interesting one, quite bizarre one, which is Sushi Singularity, just opened this month in Tokyo. Well, Sushi Singularity, you don't just make a booking and turn up. You actually make a booking, you do a DNA test, and then you turn up. And so what you have to do is you have to actually send a small sample of your saliva, and they will profile it in their labs 5 days in advance. And they will understand both your body, your DNA, and also how you respond to nutrition. And they will create the perfect sushi for you. Using 3D printing technology, they will then print the most fabulous piece of sushi you have ever had. And actually, that's no quirk. There's 3 or 4 different companies right in Europe, for example, DNA Fit, who are also doing exactly the same thing. Personalizing food exactly to your nutritional and your medical requirements. So we're moving incredibly fast, both in terms of technology and also as consumers and human beings in terms of what we like and what we expect from businesses and brands. In a sense, we're seeing a fusion of human and technology coming together. And I think you see that in every single different sector. Firstly, it's yourself, the digital and human, if you like, yourself. But we all have a digital identity now. We don't share business cards. We share LinkedIn, for example. Intelligent health. 95% of us now do initial consultations with doctors using a smartphone. Or maybe even you do an AI-based diagnostic first. Work we've talked about. Retail, we all know in terms of the automation, but also in terms of the personalization, the ways in which you can know people better, you can treat them much more personally, you can anticipate their needs and their wants. Mobility, we see that too, and even in education, as we talked about. Each one of these sectors, it's partly about the technology, but it's also about thinking how can you be more human, like that peer-to-peer connection of kids learning at the same time. I call all of these liquid businesses. So they're not just a bit of online and a bit of offline. It's truly how do you intersperse technology with physicality? How do you intersperse technology with allowing people to be more human, more personal, and interact better together? So we look at some of the innovators right now. Who are the companies who are really changing markets? They are part of the shake-up and they're part of the future. Well, let's take the world of food, for example. Who do people trust in this world? Well, typically people trust people, not the brands, but the people who they see and who they talk to. That might be their friends or it might be some form of celebrity. The world's top online chef right now, if you go to YouTube, is actually Gordon Ramsay. The food, the products which he uses, the brands which he endorses are incredibly influential in terms of what then people go to the supermarket and buy. Think about how food's made. So from Bowery to AeroFarms, changing the actual production process, the quality assurance by which vegetables, for example, are grown in actual vertical farming under perfect conditions. Think about Nestle in terms of using artificial intelligence to talk to their consumers about their skincare. So you can give precise, scientific, personalized advice in the bathroom to your consumer. Think about how Kellogg's, for example, is recycling all of its waste cereals and turning it into upcycled beer. Or the Impossible Burger. The Impossible Burger smelling, tasting, looking like the real thing. But actually, it's better for you because it's vegetarian, and it's better for the world because it reduces the carbon emissions associated with meat. And then finally thinking about the amount of waste which we've got. That fantastic company from Denmark, which looks at all of the waste which bakeries or other types of shops might have at the end of the day. And how can we be sure it doesn't go to waste at the same time? And then look at retail. Look at where that food goes to. Starbucks announced at the beginning of the lockdown that they were moving to a pickup rather than a cafe business model. No longer is it the third place, but instead it's the place where rapidly through a smartphone-based transaction you can order and you can pay, and then you just go and pick up. They're converting the majority, 70% of all of their cafes are becoming pickup points permanently. So a true shift in the terms of what Starbucks means as an organization. Amazon is rolling out its Dash Cart, not just to its own Amazon Go stores, but to any store. So you can have true intelligence at the point of purchase as the shopper walks around the store. Click and collect has become the new normal. Click and collect in terms of go to a point, or click and collect, put it in your car. So how do we move beyond that even further? And some of the traditional assets which retailers had, like car parks, for example, Walmart in the last 2 months has become the biggest drive-in cinema locations across all of the United States. And so lots and lots of examples of innovations in different ways, both in terms of how products are made, how they're shared, how they're sold, how are they delivered, how are they used. Fundamentally rethinking every aspect, ultimately thinking, how do we enable consumers to do more? That's what HelloFresh does. It gives you the recipe. It helps you make that fantastic meal, not just give you the ingredients to do it. So how can you help people to do more? Two of my favorite companies, Ping from China, the most innovative company in the world 2019. Ping started off as the delivery company for food. It then moved on to deliver groceries to people's stores. Remember, China has the largest new middle class, the people with the new incomes available, but it doesn't have the infrastructure in the traditional ways, which we do in the developed markets. So think about how can they really deliver almost anything to the consumer. And you can see here how it's not just food, it's not just groceries, but it might be cash from the cash machines, it might be cinema tickets, it might be anything which a person wants. And what they realized actually was that they're not a delivery company. That's not actually their core asset. Their core asset is that they have all this data about everything which these 4 billion consumers need. And so they are the intelligent distributor, retailer, whatever you want to call them. They know the consumer better than anybody else. So how can you truly use that in better, smarter ways? And then think about a retailer called Pinduoduo. This was one of the top 10 fastest growing companies in the world of the first 6 months of 2020. It's the fastest technology company growth in the world. So Pinduoduo was created only 5 years ago. It's a retailer, an online retailer. It's now number 2 behind Alibaba in China, and it's growing in China, but also internationally incredibly quickly. And you can see here, it's about doing more together and having more fun as you shop. Well, how do you do that? Well, it starts with the smartphone. But then it's actually about socializing the smartphone. So getting people to connect with each other, getting people to look at things, getting people to share their passions, their hobbies, their preferences together. It then gets people to play games. So it's gamification. It makes it much more fun at the same time. It then brings people together. And if they do want to buy something, they can group together and they can get a better price than anybody else can. So in a sense, what Pinduoduo call themselves is they call themselves partly a Costco or a retail warehouse, but equally they call themselves a socialized C2C company, and equally they call themselves Disneyland. So how can you bring these different kinds of ideas from different places together and fundamentally change not just how people make choices, but the entire experience they have individually and collectively? And you can see the impact of Pinduoduo over just those 5 years, particularly the last year, as they've become a first $1 trillion company from China. So rapidly growing beyond those companies which we have heard of, like Alibaba and Tencent. So all these companies, in a sense, they're thinking fundamentally differently. And I have a new book coming in December. It's called Business Recoded. The point is, it fundamentally captures the ways in which companies are shifting. Instead of being obsessed with profits, they're thinking about a bigger purpose and a more enlightened progress, which they can make for themselves commercially, but also how they can play a bigger part in society. How can they think about not just kind of competing in a market, but also reinventing markets in their own visions? How can they not just think about the technologies they can implement, but think about being ingenious in terms of how they do it? How can they work with new types of partners in ecosystems? How can they transform their businesses, not just over 10 years, but how can they constantly transform it in a much more experimental way, learning from people and do it faster and shift to this new place before others? And how can their leaders not just be good managers controlling things, but how can their leaders be extraordinary? Because we live in times which are difficult, which are incredible in some ways, and we need extraordinary leaders. So the final part is really about you. As a business leader, what will you do differently, and how can you actually look forwards, even in a time when you just want to be looking down and surviving? How can you create a better future for your business and even for the world? Well, if you look at some of the great leaders who I really admire today, truly inspiring leaders, I would go to people like Anne Wojcicki. She was an investment banker. She was reading an investment report on Wall Street, and she read about the changing world of healthcare. It said data is the future. And a bit like Ping, she said, well, how is data going to change healthcare? Well, she went about it with 23andMe. 23andMe has become the world's largest genetic coding business. So understanding your personal DNA. You spit into the test tube, you send it off, and within 7 days, she will send you a report. Everything about your body tolerances and intolerances. How can you change your diet? It'll also tell you what you die from. So how can you live a longer and better life? So really thinking differently. And what she's done over her 10 years in business is really to evolve that technology from the point where it cost $9,000 when she started to profile people's DNA. She reduced it to $900 through slightly simplifying some of the stuff which wasn't really needed, to $99, where she fundamentally does it in a different way to tell you the things you need to know rather than tell the things you don't need to know. So for $99, you can fundamentally re-understand your body and you can change your life. What she's now doing is working with GSK and some other pharmaceutical companies in really personalizing medicines for specific diseases or illnesses and changing the way in which people think about healthcare and change about staying healthy and staying fit, taking much more personal ownership of all of that. Another one is Zhang Rumin. He comes from Chengdu in China. And he's the CEO of Haier, the world's largest white goods company, so washing machines and refrigerators. What he did was he said, well, actually, I see a future. I see a future where things are completely different from today. Maybe even we give all of our washing machines and refrigerators, maybe we give them away free. Because with the Internet of Things, we can create a true ecosystem together with food manufacturers and retailers by which we can replenish those machines or we can do the washing for you. And maybe in those services rather than those products, that's where the money is. And so he's now transforming Haier to become truly a service-based business, an intelligent company, an Internet of Things company, and an ecosystem where he works with partners he'd never even dreamt of working with before. Or think about Emily Weiss. She used to have a blog. Her passion is beauty. And she used to bring people together in her blog talking about beauty tips and what they have in their bathroom cabinets. What she then realized was that actual passion for people together could actually be a business. She called it a C2C business, consumer to consumer. It's called Glossier today. Glossier is the fastest beauty company in terms of growth in the world. And actually all the products are co-created between the different members of this community. They're co-marketed by the members of this different community. And there's a huge passion for the brand because it belongs to the people and it supports the people. And it's largely online, but actually when they can do, they get together and they have Prosecco and cupcakes and they have a physical experience too. Or Jim Hagen Snaber, he's one of Europe's leading business people, the chairman of Siemens and Maersk. With Maersk, he actually re-engineered the entire shipping logistics process. Every container is now tagged with IoT and then using blockchain to fundamentally change the speed at which taxation and documentation is done as these containers move across the world from port to port. Transforming the speed at which goods can come from China to Europe, maybe from 30 days to about 5 days. And so using this technology to both transform infrastructures but also to meet people's needs for fresh products and for new ideas and more personalized things in incredibly fast ways, and allowing companies too to work as ecosystems. So the final thing is really, what will you do? What can you take away to actually survive and thrive in this changing world? Well, I'm going to leave you with 5 things. Number 1 is have a bigger vision. Look beyond today. Look beyond your business itself. Think about, what do you really do for people? Elon Musk is not just about creating space rockets or nice cars. He wants to occupy Mars. He wants to create an alternative civilization. What's your bigger idea? Maybe not that, but a bigger idea, particularly one which benefits society in some better way. So think about your why. Think about why you're in business much more than how you do business or even what you do. How and what are all about you. Why is about your consumer. They're interested in the why. So think about the purpose of your business. Secondly, Think about from the outside in. Think about these consumers. How do they feel? What's their attitudes? What's their behaviors and how they're changing? I was working with Harley Davidson. Harley Davidson is not about making motorbikes. It does, but they're not necessarily the best. But what it's about is it's giving people emotions. I want to be a 55-year-old accountant. I want to dress in black leather. And I want to drive through small towns of Austria and scare the shit out of the children. Maybe not quite that, but the idea of feeling how the consumer feels. So thinking from the outside rather than the inside gives you so much more space to innovate in different ways. And actually for Harley Davidson, if you think about their definition of what they do themselves, it's bikes. But where do they make most money? Well, firstly, merchandise. But actually the biggest money spiller is actually Harley holidays. People dressed in black leather going on vacation together. So thinking about that outer circle, the consumer's world, and how you can do more for them can be incredibly profitable. Thirdly, solve important problems. We live in this crazy world and all the different challenges we have. How can you use these new technologies to do things in better, different, and more responsible ways? We look at Adidas, for example, in terms of upcycling their shoes, using fishing nets to create better fabrics, stronger fabrics, more bouncier fabrics for their running shoes. So how can you take these new disruptive technologies, be it 3D printing or whatever, and how can you combine them with big human challenges like waste, like inequality, or like climate, and how can you innovate much more radically? It's businesses, not governments, it's businesses who can really do this. Fourthly, how can you make things happen faster? Acceleration. And really the acceleration is not just about working hard, it's actually about working smarter. It's about being much more of an experimenter, thinking about a hypothesis and then testing it, and testing and then learning from it, and then testing more ideas and learning from it. And what better time than now to try new things and to learn what works, what doesn't work, and how can we adapt them, or how can we combine them in new ways from different sectors as well as our own sector to actually be more successful. This is Amazon's model. Firstly, it's about accelerating our vision of the future. How do we see the future better than other people? That gives you a competitive advantage. How can you see how the world is changing further and faster than your competitors? Secondly, how can you innovate smarter? So maybe using new types of partners to do things with you rather than trying to do everything yourselves. How can you embrace new shortcuts, new technologies to be able to do things better? And how can you embrace humanity in that process to do things more personally and with more empathy at the same time? And then how can you implement them? How can you scale ideas up by being more focused, making smarter decisions because you have a clearer purpose as to what you're all about? So those three circles, if you like, being the ways to accelerate ideas into action. And the final thing to take away, number 5, is have a growth mindset. There's two types of mindsets in business executives, probably in the room right now. The first one is the fixed mindset. The fixed mindset is let's do what we've always done and let's make it a little bit better. Let's reduce the costs a bit. Let's improve the service a little bit. Let's tweak things. But let's essentially do what we've always done because we're too scared to do otherwise. The alternative is a growth mindset. A growth mindset is how can I keep learning? How can I keep leaving behind what doesn't work and move forwards to explore things which I've never even thought about, which could work in new and better ways? So always have this growth mindset, always looking forwards, always prepared to experiment, to fail, but to learn from that and to create a better future every day. So this should be your head now. Thinking about how can I make sense of this changing world? How can I shape the future in my own vision? Don't wait for somebody else. You are the person with as much foresight, with as much intelligence and as much creativity as anybody else. So how can you create a better future for your industry and for your business? Thirdly, in some way have a passion to make people's lives better. Care for the environment, for society. Yes, you're here to make money, but actually that money is just an enabler of doing something more, something better, having this higher purpose. Be Leonardo da Vinci. Connect ideas for all sorts of different places. Look around at all the companies which are adapting and succeeding right now. Combine them together from across different sectors. Leonardo da Vinci said, innovation is about making unusual connections. And then act with speed and agility. Do it faster, do it first and learn from it, and then do it better and better over time. But be audacious at the same time. So dare to do bigger things. Now is the time when we do need to dare. It does mean taking some risks, but they're calculated risks and they're risks in the right direction, and you can always adapt them and change them over time. But have a persistence in terms of trying to make things happen, trying to make your business better, trying to make the lives of your consumers better, and making the world better at the same time. So what will you do? We live in this time which is crazy and it's uncertain, it's complex, but it's also full of incredible change, and that means opportunity. So how can you grasp some of those opportunities? So I want to leave you with 3 things to think about. 3 incredibly simple things. Firstly, be bold. Secondly, be brave. And thirdly, be brilliant. Good luck.